Sir, why did you put my mother in your will? The little boy's question made the billionaire's smile disappear. Across the dining table, his mother froze with a spoon in her hand. For several seconds, nobody moved. The billionaire slowly looked at the boy, then at the woman who had worked quietly in his mansion for years. And finally, he said in a calm voice, "Daniel, who told you about my will?" Daniel pointed innocently toward the living room. "I saw your paper before dinner. Mommy's name was on it." His mother, Grace, almost dropped her spoon. She had never known, and what the billionaire was about to reveal would change all three of their lives forever. Richard Blackwood was a man whose name was known in every corner of the city. At 52, he owned hotels, apartment buildings, restaurants, and several companies. He had more money than he could possibly spend. But there was one thing money had never given him: a family. Richard had never married. He had no children. And although he had several relatives, he trusted almost none of them. His younger cousins visited whenever they heard he was sick. His distant nephews suddenly remembered his birthday whenever they needed money. And every Christmas, the same people who barely called him throughout the year would arrive with expensive gifts and exaggerated smiles. Richard wasn't stupid. He knew what they were waiting for: his death. Because when he died, they believed his fortune would be theirs. Then there was Grace. Grace had worked in Richard's mansion for nearly 6 years. She was quiet, hard-working, and completely different from everyone else around him. She never asked for expensive clothes. She never begged for money. When Richard gave her extra money during Christmas, she would thank him sincerely, but never expect it the following year. Her only concern was her 12-year-old son, Daniel. Daniel was a bright, respectful boy who often waited in the mansion after school until his mother finished work. Richard had slowly grown fond of him, not because Daniel treated him like a billionaire. Daniel didn't. To Daniel, Richard was simply Mr. Richard. Sometimes a boy would sit nearby while Richard worked. Sometimes he would ask him about the old photographs in the mansion. And sometimes Richard would deliberately pretend to be annoyed when Daniel made jokes. But secretly, those moments were the happiest part of his day. One Friday evening, something unusual happened. Richard walked into the kitchen while Grace was preparing dinner. "Grace." She turned immediately. "Yes, sir." Richard looked toward the living room. "Is Daniel here?" "Yes, sir. He's watching television." Richard paused. Then he said, "I want him to have dinner with me tonight." Grace stared at him. "With you, sir?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Is there another billionaire in this house?" Grace quickly shook her head. "No, sir. I wasn't expecting it." "Neither was I." He walked away. Grace stood there for a moment, wondering what had suddenly changed. Before dinner, Daniel was lying across the sofa watching television. He heard his mother moving around in the kitchen and continued watching. Then he noticed something. A drawer beneath the television cabinet was slightly open. Daniel got up. He wasn't looking for anything. He simply wanted to close it. But as he pushed the drawer, a white document caught his attention. His mother's name was printed across the page: Grace Williams. Daniel frowned. He looked closer. Underneath the name were the words: Last Will and Testament. He didn't understand everything he was seeing, but he knew one thing: his mother's name was there. Daniel pushed the drawer closed and returned to the sofa. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell anyone. He simply remembered it. That evening, Richard sat at the head of the dining table. Daniel sat across from him. Grace sat beside her son, still looking slightly uncomfortable. Richard, however, seemed unusually relaxed. He asked Daniel about school. "What subject do you like?" "Science." "Good answer." Daniel smiled. Richard leaned back. "And what do you want to become?" "A doctor." Richard nodded approvingly. "Then study hard." "Yes, sir." For a while, everything was normal. Richard even laughed when Daniel told him about one of his teachers. Then Daniel suddenly remembered the document. He looked at Richard. "Sir." Richard looked up. "Yes." Daniel pointed toward him. "Why did you put my mother's name in your will?" The room went silent. Grace's face changed instantly. "Daniel." Richard didn't speak. The warmth disappeared from his expression. Not anger. Something else. Surprise. He had not expected the boy to know. Grace looked at him. Sir, what is he talking about? Richard slowly placed his fork down. Where did you see it? Daniel answered honestly. In the drawer in the living room. Grace looked horrified. Daniel, you shouldn't have. Richard raised one hand. Grace stopped speaking. Richard looked at the boy. You weren't supposed to see that. Daniel lowered his eyes. I'm sorry, sir. Richard's expression softened. I didn't say you were in trouble. He took a slow breath. Then he looked at Grace. Your name is in my will because I want to make sure you're taken care of. Grace shook her head. But, sir, I don't understand. You don't need to understand tonight. Sir, I never asked you for. I know. His voice was gentle but firm. I know you never asked. Grace fell silent. Richard picked up his fork again. Let's finish dinner. That was all he said. No explanation. No details. And somehow, that made Grace even more uncomfortable. After dinner, Grace took Daniel to their small room at the back of the mansion. The moment the door closed, she turned toward him. Daniel. The boy looked up. Yes, Mommy? Why did you ask Mr. Richard that question? I saw your name. That doesn't mean you ask him about his private business. Daniel lowered his head. I was just curious. Grace sighed. She knelt in front of him. Listen to me. Mr. Richard is our employer. He's kind to us, and we should respect him. You cannot ask him questions about his money, his will, his property, or anything private. Yes, Mommy. If he wants you to know something, he will tell you himself. Yes, Mommy. And don't ever ask him that question again. Daniel nodded. I won't. Grace hugged him. Neither of them noticed a figure standing quietly outside their door. Richard, he had heard enough. He didn't look angry. If anything, there was a faint smile on his face. But the smile disappeared when he returned to his study. Waiting inside was his lawyer, Mr. Anderson. Richard closed the door. Did anyone see you bring the documents? No, sir. Are you certain? Yes. Richard walked toward his desk. Good. The lawyer hesitated. Sir, are you still certain about changing everything? Richard looked at him. Yes. Your relatives will fight it. I know. They may take you to court. Let them. The lawyer lowered his voice. Richard, you're leaving almost everything to people who aren't related to you. Richard looked toward the window. No, he corrected him. I'm leaving it to the people who have actually treated me like family. The lawyer nodded slowly. Then Richard's phone rang. He answered. His expression changed. What? The voice on the other end said something. Richard's face hardened. Are you sure? Another pause. Richard slowly sat down. Don't tell Grace. The lawyer looked concerned. Richard ended the call. What happened? He asked. The lawyer waited. Sir, someone has been asking questions about your new will. Richard's eyes narrowed. Who? We don't know yet. Richard looked toward the hallway. His voice became cold. Find out. Because suddenly, the will wasn't just a private decision anymore. Someone else knew about it, and they were already moving. By Monday morning, Richard knew something was wrong. He had spent the entire weekend thinking about the phone call. Someone knew about his new will. And Richard had only discussed it with 3 people, his lawyer, his banker, and himself. Yet someone was already trying to uncover the details. At breakfast, Richard noticed something else. Daniel wasn't there. Where's the boy? He asked. Grace looked surprised. He's outside, sir. Richard stood. Bring him in. A few minutes later, Daniel entered. Richard looked at him. You're unusually quiet. Daniel smiled nervously. Mommy said I should behave around you. Richard almost laughed. Your mother is right about many things. He paused. But she doesn't need to teach you to be afraid of me. Daniel looked up. I'm not afraid of you, sir. Good. Richard smiled. Then sit. Daniel sat. Richard poured him a glass of juice. School today? Yes, sir. Good. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Then Richard noticed Grace watching them from the doorway. She looked worried. Richard understood. She was still thinking about the will. He stood. Grace, Come to my office after breakfast." She swallowed. "Yes, sir." When Grace entered Richard's office, he closed the door. She stood nervously. "You wanted to see me, sir?" "Yes." Richard remained behind his desk. "You've worked for me for 6 years." "Yes, sir." "Have I ever given you a reason to believe I wanted anything from you?" Grace looked confused. "No, sir." "Have you ever stolen from me?" "No." "Have you ever lied to me?" Grace hesitated. Richard noticed. "Grace." She looked down. "Not intentionally, sir." Richard leaned back. "That's why you're in my will." Grace's eyes widened. "Sir, I don't want your money." "I know." "I mean it." "I know." "Then why?" Richard was silent for several seconds. Then he finally answered. "Because I watched what happened when I was at my lowest." Grace stared at him. "You were sick 3 years ago," he continued. "Your relatives came into this house every day." Grace nodded. "They weren't worried about you," Richard said. "They were worried about what would happen to your companies." Grace remained silent. "I remember one evening when my doctor told me I might not survive the night." Richard smiled bitterly. "Do you know who stayed?" Grace shook her head. "You." She looked surprised. "You stayed in this mansion until morning." "I was only doing my job." "No." Richard's voice softened. "You were doing more than your job." He opened a drawer and removed an old envelope. "Do you remember this?" Grace stared at it. "No, sir." Richard placed it on the desk. 3 years ago, when my family believed I was dying, one of my relatives tried to convince me to sign a document giving him control of my companies. Grace's eyes widened. "You stopped him?" "I didn't know." Richard nodded. "You did." Grace looked confused. "How?" "You refused to let anyone disturb me that night. You told them the doctor said I needed rest." Richard smiled faintly. "You probably don't remember." Grace did, but she never imagined it mattered. Richard continued. "You protected me when you thought nobody important was watching." He paused. "And that's when I realized something." "What, sir?" Richard looked directly at her. "I had spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me." His voice became quiet. "Then I met 2 people who wanted nothing." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "You and Daniel." But while Richard was telling Grace the truth, someone else was searching his office. His cousin, Victor. Victor had been Richard's closest relative for years. He had also been counting on becoming the next owner of the Blackwood Empire. That afternoon, Victor confronted Richard. "I heard you've changed your will." Richard didn't even look up from his papers. "You heard correctly. Who did you leave everything to?" Richard looked up. "Why does it matter to you?" "Because I'm family." Richard smiled coldly. "Family?" Victor stepped closer. "You know what I mean." "Yes." Richard stood. "I know exactly what you mean." Victor's voice hardened. "You're seriously leaving your fortune to a maid?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "You've been asking questions you had no right to ask." "It's your money." "Exactly." Richard walked around the desk. "And that is why I decide where it goes." Victor stared at him. "You'll regret this." Richard stopped. "No." He looked him directly in the eyes. "The people who spent their lives waiting for me to die will regret it." Victor left furious. But he wasn't finished. That evening, Grace couldn't find Daniel. She searched the kitchen, the garden, the living room. Nothing. Her heart began racing. "Daniel!" She ran outside. Richard heard her shouting and immediately came out. "What happened?" "My son is missing." Richard's face changed. Within minutes, the entire mansion was being searched. Then Daniel appeared from behind the garden wall. Grace rushed toward him. "Where were you?" Daniel looked frightened. "A man called me." Richard immediately stepped forward. "What man?" Daniel pointed toward the gate. "I don't know him." Richard crouched in front of the boy. "What did he say?" Daniel swallowed. "He said my mother was going to become rich." Richard's expression hardened. "What else?" He said. Daniel hesitated. "He said I shouldn't trust you." Silence. Richard slowly stood. He knew someone was trying to frighten the boy, and they weren't going to stop. That night, Richard called his lawyer. I want that we'll finalize tomorrow. The lawyer nodded. And the guardianship arrangement? Everything. He paused. Daniel will be protected whether I'm alive or not. The lawyer looked at him. Are you expecting something? Richard looked toward the window. No. Then he corrected himself. I don't expect trouble. He picked up the final document. I'm prepared for it. The next morning, Richard gathered everyone in the mansion, his relatives, his lawyer, Grace, Daniel, and several senior employees. Victor stood at the back of the room. Richard held the new will in his hand. He looked around. For years, many of you believed my fortune would automatically become yours. Nobody spoke. You waited for me to grow old. He looked at Victor. You waited for me to become weak. Victor's jaw tightened, and some of you even tried to interfere with my decisions. Richard placed the document on the table. But you forgot something. He smiled. My money belongs to me while I'm alive. He turned toward Daniel. And I am perfectly capable of deciding what happens to it. The lawyer opened the document. Richard's relatives leaned forward. Then the lawyer read the inheritance arrangement. Grace would receive enough to secure her future. But the majority of Richard's estate, including his companies and properties, would eventually pass to Daniel under a protected trust. Everyone erupted. Victor stepped forward. This is insane. Richard didn't move. You're giving billions to a child? Richard calmly answered, No. He looked at Daniel. I'm giving it to the one person who never asked me for a single coin. Grace began crying. Daniel stared at Richard, completely overwhelmed. Victor shouted, You don't know what you're doing. Richard's voice suddenly became firm. Enough. The entire room went silent. This was the other side of Richard. The warm man who joked with Daniel was gone. The billionaire had returned. He looked at Victor and said, You spent years waiting for my death. Daniel spent those same years simply hoping his mother would have enough money to keep him in school. Victor said nothing. Richard continued, That is the difference between you. Then he turned toward Daniel. The boy was still staring at him. Richard smiled. Come here. Daniel walked toward him. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to become like me. Daniel looked up. Then what should I become? Richard smiled. Someone people can trust. Daniel nodded. And for the first time in years, Richard felt like the mansion wasn't empty anymore. He had spent his whole life building an empire. But in the end, he discovered that the greatest thing he could leave behind wasn't his money. It was a family he never thought he would have. And the relatives who had waited years for his fortune, they left that mansion with nothing but the realization that blood doesn't always make you family. Sometimes, family is simply the person who stays when there's nothing to gain. The end. If this story touched you, subscribe for more emotional and suspenseful stories. And don't forget to share with someone who loves a good twist.